So let me turn to internal rate of return. This is, again, a review. The basic idea is to calculate what amounts to a yield to maturity for a given set of cash flows. So you've got a particular investment at date zero. You've got a bunch of cash flows starting next period, CF1 through CFT. And what you want to calculate is the single number such that it makes this a zero NPV project. That is, the initial investment adds up to all of the cash flows. All right? That's what the internal rate of return is. It is literally nothing more nor less than the yield to maturity of a standard coupon bond. But instead of coupons and the principal, what we've got here are the cash flows of the project. It's the yield to maturity of a project. You can think of it as the average yield that such a sequence of cash flows offers to its owner. Okay? Now, I'm not going to take you through the capital budgeting approach because I think all of you know what the typical approach is. You know, take projects that have a IRR greater than your hurdle rate and don't take it when you have it below. But I do want to talk about the complexities. It turns out that IRR gives you the same answer as NPV in a very special set of circumstances, but in many other circumstances, it will not give you the same answer as NPV. So you've got to be very careful in how you use IRR. And the examples that I give, I'll show you in a few minutes, can lead to some really crazy decisions if you end up using IRR. For example, in certain cases that I'll show you shortly, there is going to be no IRR. You can't compute one. In other cases, there'll be multiple IRRs, and it's going to be kind of hard to figure out how that compares to your hurdle rate. Do you want to take the highest one or the lowest one? It's really up for grabs. And so the bottom line that we usually teach in our capital budgeting section of introductory finance is don't use IRR. Now, how could that be if I just showed you that 75% of CEOs and CFOs rely on IRR? It's not credible to say never use IRR. And it's because there is actually a very important application of IRR that I'll get to in a few minutes. So I'm changing a bit of the party line that we teach in introductory finance. There are some very important applications of IRR that I will get to shortly. But before that, let me do the party line and show you all the bad things that can happen to you if you use this method. So this is the example where using a simple hurdle rate is going to give you the wrong answer, particularly if projects involve cash flows that come in initially and go out later on. What's an example of something like that? Anybody? Can you give me an example of some kind of a financial transaction where magically you get money now and you've got to give back money later? Yeah, it's a very specialized thing called a loan. I think all of you are familiar with that. So loans cannot be analyzed using the simple rule. If you've got an IRR greater than the threshold, take it. And if you don't take it. In fact, for loans, it's the reverse. Now, that's simple enough. But if you have more complicated cash flows like these, and by the way, these, I think you will agree, do not look so pathological that you can never imagine having an investment project that looks like that, right? Here's an example where you have to put some money down now, and then you get some cash flows, and then you have to put some money down later. Does that look familiar at all to you? For those of you who are in the life sciences, is that like paying for a phase 1 trial, reaching a milestone and getting some money, and then having to pay for a phase 2 trial? Well, if that is your cash flow, you can't find an IRR. It doesn't exist for this particular cash flow, nor does it exist for this cash flow. So, and this is a case where you've got multiple IRRs. You've got 4%, 7%, or 10%. Take your pick. Which one would you prefer? You can't just arbitrarily decide on one of these multiple IRRs. It's going to lead to the wrong answer. So these are the standard party line reasons why you shouldn't use it. And of course, the scale issue and incremental cash flows run into all sorts of problems. So bottom line, use NPV. When is IRR useful? It turns out that it is the predominant measure used by venture capitalists for calculating rates of return on their startup activities. And the reason for this is really pretty simple. It's because that's usually the only data they have. In other words, they have how much money they put in and how much money they get out. That's it. And if they put in more money later on, they don't include that as part of the original investment. That's now a different investment, a Series B or a Series C investment that gets analyzed on its own. And you can take a look at what the average IRRs are among all of the various investments without getting into too much trouble. It makes sense. And it's because it's very difficult to calculate rates of return in any other way for startups. First of all, they don't trade on an open market. So it's not like we can actually figure out exactly what a particular biotech project is going to be worth. You can try, but it's going to be challenging. And at any point in time, you may be faced with illiquid markets, distressed sales, and the price can be nowhere near reflective of what the true earnings potential is. Second, biotech companies, they don't generate cash flows initially. In many cases, ever, in which case you can't use standard net cash flow NPV calculations. So the only thing that's left for a venture capitalist is how much money did I put in? How much money do I get out? And if there are intermediate payments along the way, you can actually include that in your IRR calculation. Now, another measure that venture capitalists use is cash-on-cash returns. You've probably heard of it, 3x, 5x, 10x. Again, those are back-of-the-envelope numbers. Obviously, VCs understand the time value of money. They know that 3x doesn't always mean the same thing if you get 3x after 1 year versus 3x after 10 years. But it's a shorthand since most venture capital funds have similar lives. Just using cash-on-cash returns is a quick way of getting a sense of how they're doing. But because biotech venture capital uses this, very often biotech companies, entrepreneurs, investors, and pharma executives will continue to use this because that's what they're used to. They came out of that market. They came out of those particular kinds of shops and skills. And so that's one of the reasons why in biomedicine it does persist. And there's nothing wrong with it as long as you understand its limitations. And in most cases, the limitations won't be an issue because you're dealing with cash flows in at the start, cash flows out later on. If ever you have a situation where you've got cash flows coming in and out over the course of a life, you should be very nervous about using IRR, and you go back to the NPV calculations at that point. Okay?